Well, looks like the shopping list for one has become a series. To anyone new to this, firstly, why are you starting on the video clearly labeled 3 in a series? But also, this is a series where we will cover a lot of small games at once. Lots of games come out, and a lot of them get forgotten about if they're small. So I'm here to collect them and throw them back into the world. And when they're not big enough to make a video on their own, I make sure they don't get left behind by lumping them together into one video. Consider it a collection of mini reviews, sorta. They might be experimental, short, or just more basic than what I usually cover. It's a real grab bag with these videos. As I said before, anarchy reigns with this format, so be prepared for anything. If you don't get the gist of the format, don't worry, you'll figure it out. So without further ado, let's dive into this. In terms of small games people don't give appreciation, visual novels probably get the worst. It's a genre that most people frown upon for its lack of gameplay, some going as far as say they aren't even games. But you can probably tell from my channel that I appreciate games for a lot more than just gameplay. And I think visual novels are a valuable genre for what they can do compared to the books people like to say they are, and some great stuff has come out of it. The best visual novels do something that nothing else can, telling stories that only work because of the medium and interactivity, and it manages to tell the story exactly how it wants due to not having to throw a gameplay that can sometimes sink the narrative experience for otherwise great game stories. Though that's not to say they can't have gameplay, but it simply isn't the main focus compared to the story. The strength of the genre shows in that there's plenty of beloved games that are mostly visual novels, like Ace Attorney, Danganronpa, Valhalla, DDLC, or Telltale games. Yet most still sweep the genre under the rug by saying these don't count. But visual novels are finally starting to get more recognition in smaller spaces, such as with our first game, Bad End Theater.
To the lost but cold, take your seats everyone, welcome to Bed and Theater. When the curtains close, you'll come away stronger, or maybe you'll break. Not my fault you sought this pain.
Bad End Theater is a visual novel puzzle game made by Nom Nom Nami, a small developer on itch.io who makes a lot of LGBT-focused visual novels, with this as their first official paid release. The game sees you attend the Bad End Theater, a strange theater that only shows tragedies on loop and lets you decide the show it puts on. You go through the variations of the play to see all the tragedies and see if there's maybe a happy ending hidden away. As a visual novel, this game lives and dies on its writing, and thankfully the script here is excellent. The narration just exudes so much charm that you can really feel the developer's sense of humor through it, because the game is just a riot with so many little bits. The game contrasts the usual dramatic tone with the more casual and silly one for the perfect amount of tonal whiplash, and when combined with some of the more anticlimactic story turns, it makes for something that made me smile the whole way through. This is helped by the game's characters, who are simple but extremely enjoyable. Each of them is really just a cartoonish stereotype with some kind of twist turned on it, such as a maiden who wants to be captured, a henchman who really doesn't care about doing evil, and an overlord who rules with an extremely apathetic and laid-back fist. These characters are super simple, but it's just enough depth to make them feel more like real people and help their writing land. Each of them is brimming with personality, and a fair bit of that is helped by the art, which we'll get into later, and all of them just have great dynamics that are fun to watch. While the writing is obviously what gets center stage, the bits of gameplay do an excellent job at holding it together. Whereas most visual novels leave it to really only reading and maybe a choice here and there, a Bad End Theater decides to throw in a unique puzzle system. When you replay the show, you choose to follow the story of only one character, able to make choices for them, but the others just go through their emotions automatically. But you can change what aspects the characters do or don't have after making the choices as them, and this can change how they act through the show and what they do when you aren't controlling them. Doing this allows you to open up brand new routes for every character, and it turns into a small but very fun puzzle as you try to figure out what combinations are needed to access certain branches. And while it's fun in terms of gameplay, the multiple character approach really helps the writing, as it doesn't only let us control them, but also see their deeper thoughts and feelings. We get to see how they react to everything that can happen on various paths, seeing their fears, deeper motivations as you get closer and closer to their true ending, getting attached to them deeply as you can just hope and beg that you can find a happy ending they deserve. And that works excellently to build up the ending, which I won't dare spoil, but it's just perfect. And as a little cherry on top, we have what is the most striking about the game: the wonderful art. It's really something I can't analyze too much, as it does speak for itself, but it's just so nice to look at with how adorable everything looks, and how great the designs of our characters are. Not to mention how the game uses its monochromatic palettes to make it even more distinct. Overall, Bad in Theater is a wonderful visual novel, both for those who already enjoy the genre and those just now giving it a chance. From a wonderful story to surprisingly good gameplay and tied together with a perfect presentation, it's a complete package. The only warning I might give is that the game is a bit short for the price, only being a couple hours at most for $10. But I think the game is more than worth it for just how impactful and memorable it is. So please do pick it up if it interests you. So here we have a new indie Metroidvania. Wait, no, please don't leave. Okay, so these days, at least in my circle, Metroidvanias feel almost a dime a dozen. But seriously, while a few years ago it was cool to be a revival in the style of Metroid or Castlevania, it's gotten real watered down, with plenty hopping on the wagon once it became popular, or borrowing elements of the genre to become more marketable. I sort of blame this on the release of Hollow Knight and other such games that really kicked off the craze we see now. It's easy to just have them all blend together, with only really art style making them stand out at all. It's not to say they're bad games in this genre, just that it's harder to stand out as one with such a flooded market. But sometimes, despite this trend, one will come out that truly stands out with a brilliant addition to the format. And one such game is what we've got here with Unsighted. Unsighted is a Metroidvania made by Studio Pixelpunk, a small team of Brazilian devs, and published by Humble Bundle in 2021. The game is set in a ruined city after a great war between humans and machines, the humans having been defeated, but not before covering the great meteor that gave the machines their sentience, leaving them to go into hiding lest they go insane and bloodthirsty. You take control of a robot named Alma, as you awaken from a deep slumber after your loss in the war, and come back up to explore, collect shards of the meteor, and find your lost lover, all while racing against time before you and everyone else goes unsighted. Now, the first thing that immediately stands out about Unsighted is the top-down perspective. Foregoing the usual Metroid-style 2D gameplay of other Metroidvanias, this game gives an entirely different feel from how it changes combat, which we'll get into in a bit, the way exploration feels, and changes to focus on platforming to puzzle solving. Now, this immediately is a breath of fresh air that opens up so many possibilities for the game. One of which is the combat I mentioned before. Combat in Metroidvanias is usually a highlight, especially when it comes to their boss fights, and somehow Unsighted manages to expand on and create even better combat than some. Unsighted's combat is simple at first glance, but it has a well of depth to it. The game's combat is very similar to something like Fury, a top-down mix of shooting and simple melee that lets players either pick them off from afar or smash them to pieces up close. And expanding upon that, the game gives a wealth of weapon options, allowing you to use two at the same time on either of the mouse buttons, and you're free to pick and choose any kind of strange build you want. This allows for so much strategy and player freedom, as you can go all in on guns, having a mix of slow and quick melee, or go with oddball weapons like grappling hooks or grenade launchers to spice up your loadout and allow for stranger strategies like grappling yourself to an enemy and pulling them in to tear them apart with your axe. There's just so many possibilities to play with. And while this could easily be enough for the combat system to feel rich, combat gets another layer of complexity with the parrying system. Rather than just dodging, parries give a dynamic way to handle enemy attacks, with either just blocking all their damage and striking back, or if you have the skill, you can precisely time a perfect parry to get them stunned and deal a critical strike for so much damage. It adds a real element of risk-reward to the combat that I love, even if it's less than perfect, with it being a bit easy to abuse at times with the forgiving time window. Throw in even more complexities like stamina management tying into ammo, jump and spin attacks, how you have to be careful about healing, and also chips which act like pins or badges that modify your build, and you have one hell of a combat system, and this gets put to the test in the boss fights. Each of these bosses serve as good challenges and tests of skill, bringing in unique mechanics and challenges, and having varied attack patterns. They make for excellent rushes of combat. My only complaint is that they have a ton of health without really ever going into new phases all that often. It can feel a bit spongy at times rather than a real gauntlet. But aside from that, they're really great. Now as for the exploration, the game is also excellent in terms of that. Like other Metroidvanias, the world is very interconnected once you have all your tools, and there's plenty of secrets and areas to discover. While the movement options aren't all that exciting at first, the game really picks up with later items you find, like the grappling hook and especially the spinner. The spinner may just be one of my favorite upgrades in a Metroidvania, with just how fun the movement is on it, along with the sheer rush of grinding on rails. Not to mention that it actually has a combat use too. But while the movement is good, it's the freedom the player has with exploration that makes the game special. There's very few things that can actually gate you as a player in this game. You're free to find ways to go basically anywhere from the very start of the game, and although areas will still be blocked off in some ways, you can find your way around them to sequence break everything. And just like its grandfather Super Metroid, it's so open that you can fight the bosses in reverse order. And this level of exploration is vital, considering how much you may have to be looking for items, considering the central mechanic of the game with the characters and the time limit system. I do wish I could be as talkative about the characters, but while they're good, they fall a little flat in comparison to the other aspects of the game. Don't get me wrong, they're all still plenty likable, and delving into their character a tiny bit more through the mechanic we'll get into in a bit is nice, but they don't feel as strong in the personality department as they should be in my opinion. But still, every NPC serves a gameplay purpose in some way, and this makes it easy to get attached to them regardless. And this comes back to bite you, as every character in the game is slowly dying due to the meteor being covered. Every single character, including yourself, has a time limit for how long they'll last, some having less time than others. The only way to extend that time is to give them meteor dust you can find around the world in scarce quantities. If you aren't able to play the game fast and efficiently, you'll be forced to make tough decisions on where to use that dust. Will you save yourself so you can have that breathing room for your playthrough? Will you save those who have useful things for you? Or will you save those you're attached to, even if they don't serve a purpose to you anymore? Or will you forego these choices by just playing better? Because you can avoid the morality by simply speedrunning through the game, making smart use of meteor dust, and end up saving everyone. It's an interesting dichotomy between moral choice and gameplay in every regard, and really is a genius mechanic that got me hooked and kept the game tense the whole way through. But no game is perfect, and this one has its fair share of flaws too. For starters, as I said before, I feel character writing and interactions could have been tightened up more in order to really get that deep connection to these characters and make you desperate to get everyone out of this alive. Even if they only have a few lines of dialogue, other games have pulled it off, and I have no doubt this game could have too with a few more drafts. But what we have now is not bad. My much bigger complaint with the game is that the time limit mechanic isn't harsh enough for my liking. You're never really forced into having to make difficult calls and decisions, or play much faster in order to save everyone. Hell, I was able to screw around a lot and still made it to the end of the game with basically everyone without much struggle in my playthrough. It kinda takes away the strength of having to choose people based on either usefulness or personality when you'll be able to save them all easily. Not to mention it renders the whole extra mechanic of stealing time for yourself as a last resort utterly useless. I think it would be a lot better if it was made a bit harsher and made meteor dust a bit more sparse. Not too much, of course, but just a little bit so screwing around like I did is a bit more punished. But aside from those smaller complaints, Unsighted makes for a new Metroidvania that doesn't just blend in with the rest of the crowd, even if it still takes inspiration in places. If you want a more fresh experience and you don't mind it being less than perfect, I would highly recommend picking this one up. Sometimes games end up harder to fit into my usual video formula. Not because I don't have much to say about them, but just because they're stranger in structure compared to other games. Whether that be in having a heavy story focus, such as with Disco Elysium or Not for Broadcast, that makes it difficult to do an analysis on the other elements of the game, or the game can just be more experimental in what it wants to do, making for a very specific kind of experience, such as with Unpacking. Unpacking is a small puzzle game made by Witchbeam, a small studio who primarily made arcade-style games before this. Unpacking sees you following an unnamed character through their coming into adulthood, going through several moves between different homes. You get to sort out not only the boxes and where they go, but also their life as you see what things they take with them and what things they leave behind, giving you a small story of their life. Unpacking is a rather simple game. You move into a new house or room, you have a ton of boxes, and you're tasked with unpacking them and putting the items in the right spots. And that's really all there is to it. There is a puzzle element with needing to know where things go, but really it's just unpacking things without any real challenge or other kind of engagement to it. But while it may be simple, that's exactly what it's trying to be. Unpacking doesn't try to be anything bigger. It's going for one specific engagement, and it absolutely nails it, which is this almost relaxing calm from sorting out items into the right place and having it all organized and perfect. It definitely taps into the organization-addicted autism parts of my brain, and God, is it a powerful kind of serotonin to tap into. There's nothing quite like starting with an absolute mess, and eventually ending up with a beautiful, clean home to look at. It's the same kind of satisfaction one gets from games like Power Wash Simulator, or even something like a tycoon game of starting with nothing and eventually having a beautiful end product. It's a very different type of enjoyment from what most games offer, but it makes it into the perfect relaxing game. And adding on to that relaxing, homey feel of it all is that the game allows for a lot of player freedom. The game is incredibly loose in how you can complete areas, letting you organize and personalize these homes to your heart's content. You can arrange shelves in just the right way, set up the most efficient desk layout, or just have fun making an organization system for the clothes. It lets you be yourself and find your own type of satisfaction in decoration which is just perfect. And all of this is completed by the wonderful pixel graphics, all of it managing to feel so cozy with all the little knickknacks realized perfectly, and these homes feeling so simple, it's so full of detail and charm by the time you finish decorating. It toes a fine line to make sure you can fully appreciate the move, but also to where the home doesn't feel overwhelming with all these different objects thrown into it. It manages to stick the landing, and these homes become fun to walk through after you're finished with them, appreciating the new cozy space. And this perfectly relaxing atmosphere is completed by the score, composed by acclaimed composer Jeff Van Dyke. The soundtrack combines a wonderful acoustic guitar with magical sounding synth and chiptune, making for a very unique sound that brings about feelings of calm, yet also wonder and joy. It fits the overall tone of the game perfectly, especially when we get into the silent story it tells. Because while the game may seem like it's just pure relaxation at first, Unpacking is dedicated to telling a story alongside that. One that gets told silently, simply through the environment and items in your boxes. Through these, you can piece together a story as your character grows up and eventually moves out, trying and failing to land on their feet before finally finding happiness. You watch them struggle and succeed at work, you watch their financial situation bounce around, and you watch as their relationships fumble as well, as they try to discover themselves and eventually find true happiness with someone they really love. It manages to pull off these story twists and beats perfectly, while barely saying a word except for the bits in your journal once you beat level. The ways they do this are just really creative at times. Alongside that, the game throws in so much personality with the small details. The main character isn't just a stand-in nobody to go through these events. They have a strong personality of their own that we can see through the items they keep, through the work they make, and through the various interests they have and keep throughout their life. Through the course of the game, we really get to feel like we know this person and can really empathize with them because of just how human they feel. It's really incredible silent characterization. Overall, Unpacking offers a simple experience that nothing else does. It's relaxing, satisfying, and just so heartfelt. It offers relaxation and player freedom in a way nothing else in its genre does, if it even has a genre to call its own. It's a one-of-a-kind experience I honestly recommend to anyone. It's a little short for $20, but the experience it offers is more than worth the price tag. Pick it up if it's on sale or if it sounds like your kind of game. Back in the day, if there was one scene that ruled the indie space, it was the RPG Maker scene. From horror, to puzzles, to actual RPGs, to strange experimental stuff. The scene gave us so many legendary games, like Off, Yume Nikki, Lisa the Painful, Ebe, and so many others. It used extremely limited tools to create some really memorable things through pure artistry and writing, plus stretching the engine to its very limits. But these days, the scene has sadly gone quiet mostly, only occasionally pumping out something new like Amori, and sequels or fan stuff for older works like Hylux 2 or Lisa fan games. But occasionally, someone goes back to these old tools to make something incredible and memorable, such as with Grimm's Hollow. Grimm's Hollow is an RPG Maker game made by Ghost Hunter, a small solo dev with this as their first published game. In this game, you play as Lavender, a young lady who has recently died and woken up in a strange afterlife known as the Hollow, where she is supposed to become a Reaper and help souls move on. But as she died with her little brother, it becomes a race against time to find him in the Hollow and help him get back to life. The game was released around Halloween of 2019, and is completely free. Now, the first thing that caught my eye other than it being free and the adorable cover art was the concept behind the game. The game goes through a very different type of afterlife. The Hollow is somewhat of an in-between, a before afterlife. It's where souls go that can't quite move on yet, either forming as ghosts who are twisted and corrupted by their earthly attachments, or as reapers. Reapers are special souls that come to the Hollow with their original bodies, tasked with reaping enough of these wilder souls in order to earn their right to move on. And they actually become quite tragic, as you learn that Reapers aren't actually skeleton people. They're human, and they wear those masks because as they spend time in the Hollow, their bodies begin to break apart and decay, losing parts of themselves. Like how Lavender has already lost her eyes. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about the world Grimm's Hollow builds up is that we never get to see what the actual afterlife is. It's left as a big mystery, and I think that helps the more serious parts of the game's tone. It keeps full death as this big thing with no real answer, as this dreadful yet beautiful concept that we're faced with the entire game. Whether it's better to live in perpetual decay or sacrifice yourself to the unknown is a question the game will ask you the whole way through. But the game as a whole isn't as serious as its world building makes it sound. The game is incredibly goofy when it comes to everything else. The game takes major inspiration from stuff like Earthbound and Undertale for its writing, everything and everyone having some little gag or a bit of charm to them. It's nothing laugh-out-loud funny like Earthbound, but it has a lot of personality to its writing, and it's just really pleasant. From the very first scene, it's enough to get most people hooked in and caring about this world and its characters. And that's critical for RPG Maker games especially, as they've never been able to rely on gameplay much to hook people. But that's not to say Grimm's Hollow's gameplay is bad. It manages to build on the usual formula well. RPG Maker games are notorious for being incredibly standard in terms of RPG combat. That's just natural with the engine. It's a combat system not really made to be anything but a standard, tried and true RPG. But that hasn't stopped you from trying to make it more interesting by pushing the system to its limits. And while Grimm's Hollow doesn't completely change it like how something like Amori does, it takes steps in the right direction. The game goes with the basic RPG combat of basic attacks, MP, special attacks, statuses, and yada yada yada. But it begins to diverge in interesting ways, with firstly adding in action commands to combat. While they aren't anything to the quality of Paper Mario or Bug Fables, they do enough to make combat not just a slog when you aren't using your special attacks. And those special attacks are actually really diverse in what they do, and allow for lots of strategies to optimize combat, rewarding your brains with skipping otherwise tedious fights. But the biggest thing that Grimm's does to change up RPG Maker is the upgrade system. Where most RPG Maker games just have the tried and true level up system, Grimm's Hollow gives you the Soul Tree. This is an upgrade tree representing Lavender's soul. Here, you spend the souls you collect through the game, the same things you use to buy items, making your experience points and money the same thing. This already adds an interesting dichotomy of spending points, having to allocate what to spend where, but it goes beyond this, as the tree allows for just enough customization to let you spec into types of gameplay or small builds if you want to play that way. Or you can just grind up the tree to completion at any point. It's a system that allows for a lot of player freedom and makes the process of leveling up far more interesting. But the combat is really carried by the enemy design. Whereas most RPGs can suffer due to their enemies being nothing but bags of HP that can hit you back, Grimm's Hollow decides to make things more interesting by specializing their enemies and making combat into more of a puzzle. Each enemy in Grimm's Hollow only really does one thing and has a special gimmick, either taking any damage you dish out to other enemies, attacking much harder once attacked for the first time, growing more powerful as the fight goes on, or more just interesting mechanics such as with the lover ghost or the trio near the end of the game. These gimmicks make you have to think about combat more, and while they end up being rather simple puzzles, they make the combat at least something far more interesting than just wailing on enemies with your strongest attacks. You end up having to think about the order they must be taken out, and the best way to achieve that with the special moves you have, once again allowing you to optimize combat to make it more mentally engaging. Now, while all of that is wonderful, it's not what got me to play the game. No, what got me to give the game a try is the excellent art this game has. While the overall stuff is a bit plain and not that great looking at times, it's easily carried by literally everything else. The art style within the battle sprites and artwork is just incredible, being the perfect mix of absolutely adorable and a bit spooky. It's all drawn incredibly well, whether through the pixel art or through the gorgeous sketchy style the game has. Hell, even the menus are just so charming in how they're designed and drawn. Every bit of this game's visuals are oozing with charm. And this aesthetic is completed by the game's score, also done by Natbird and Bruno Bugsley. And this score is just incredible for the atmosphere it brings. It's one of those soundtracks that has a tone of range, but all sounds connected by a similar sound font. This one being a spooky feeling through the instrumentals chosen. It's actually incredible that it manages to keep that Halloween-like tone through every track, as they shift between more relaxing themes, shop themes, bittersweet themes, and high-intensity boss tracks without ever losing that feel to them. It really completes the atmosphere of the game. But while I expected to love the visuals and sound, what I wasn't expecting is how great the writing in this game is. Not just in simple laughs and charm, but in creating such engaging characters and a really touching story. The characters of Grimm's Hollow are simplistic at first, but end up becoming really fleshed out through the course of the game. All of them have a lot more depth than you would expect, and you end up incredibly familiar with and attached to this tiny cast of characters by the end of the game. From Lavender's determination really just being a sign of her overworking and overworrying nature, to Grimm seeming like some ominous force but really just being a sweet caretaker with poor social skills. All of them have lots of nuance beneath their surface level traits. And all of this builds an incredibly emotional story that tackles the concept of loss, death, and grief through Lavender's quest to save her brother from a fate she feels he doesn't deserve, and the villain's wish to just return to life out of fear of death and what waits for them all. And all of this is wrapped up in the old problems that Lavender still holds within her, and hopes she may resolve before she has to say goodbye to her brother. It's a surprisingly touching story that comes together in an ending that got me emotional in such a short amount of time. Grimm's Hollow absolutely deserves its place amongst the best RPG Maker games, with its lovely combat, charming art, and incredible writing. And it's a game that absolutely everyone should try. It's completely free on Steam, and only a couple hours long to get every ending. It's an absolute treat, so please do check it out if you have the time. It deserves more love and attention. But that's all for now. See y'all in the next video, wherever that takes us.